This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Henry Kaufman. He's an economist, formerly of Salomon Brothers, known affectionately by the name Dr. Doom. He is 93 years young. Today we discuss his book, his new book, where he's talking about his call that he made in August of 1982, which then went on to be a massive bull market from that point in time. I always enjoy the opportunity on this podcast to bring on historical figures. Now, we don't get a full hour with Henry today, but still, he does have one particular warning or insight for all of us that we may want to consider. Look, Henry at 93 has seen a lot of cycles and a lot of different types of markets. So I find his warning especially, let's just say, concerning. Without any further delay, let's jump right in with my conversation with Henry Kaufman. Let me take you back, though, in time, because you've got this cool new book out that I have in front of me. You've got a lot of experience. We're talking decades on Wall Street. In my limited time with you today, what I want to, in fact, I almost want to start at the end, because when I look at the very last paragraph of your book, you're kind of given ominous warning to all of us. You say very clearly that we could be perhaps moving from a capitalistic type America to a statist America. Let me let you start right there and why you would say something like that.
Well, this is because the federal government and the central bank, the Federal Reserve, are playing an overarching role in managing the economy. They are intervening much more in financial institutions. There's a huge program coming on infrastructure, a huge program that has come on in order to help state and local governments to overcome the current pandemic. The states are becoming somewhat more subservient than they used to be, rather than being independent. The role of government in trying to cure our problems is becoming overarching. We're becoming much more dependent on the role of government than we used to be years ago.
Can you put yourself to a place or a moment to where you think that shift really started?
This shift started gradually over the last few decades. I would say the last 3 decades. Among other things, the Federal Reserve and the government in general allowed a significant concentration of financial assets, concentration in fewer financial institutions than years ago. Less than a handful of financial institutions dominate our financial system today. Certainly, there are mammoth financial institutions today that do everything from underwriting to managing money to counseling to all kinds of lending activities, which we didn't have years ago. We had much more of a diversified system in operation. At the same time, the government, through its activities through the pandemic, has really become much more important. The states have become more subservient than they were a decade or two ago.
I went through your whole book, but to see that last paragraph is quite ominous. Even though we lay out a scenario that doesn't sound so rosy, and you were known back in the 60s and 70s, Dr. Doom, you were known as the guy who had a kind of bearish stance, but there was a date in 1982, in August, where you, I think it's fair to say, single-handedly started the bull market?
More or less. I had written a memorandum just before August 17th, 1982, in which I felt that the worst pressure in the financial markets were over, that we were going to move into more monetary accommodation, and that there would be a recovery in economic activity. That memorandum produced a significant rally in which stocks, just for the day alone, increased 5% in value, and over 10 days or so, the market was up 15%, and interest rates started to fall rather sharply. I was late in that call, but the response by the market was very substantial, partly because I was known for my views. The market was fully aware of what my views were because I had been writing about it weekly. I was writing speeches and commentaries, so I had a very substantial following in the financial markets. Some of our publications at the time, like the Weekly Comments on Credit, reached nearly 25,000 institutional participants here and abroad. So I was known that I had had negative views for a long time in the 1970s. Then I changed my mind on August 17th, 1982.
Was there one particular trigger? I mean, obviously, to put people back in the 1970s, we had the 73, 74 bear market. The S&P was down 50%. Guys like Charlie Munger lost 65, 70% on their accounts. Carter came in, an oil crisis. We had the Iran crisis. So coming into the early 80s, okay, we have a new president. We have Reagan, and he wants to go the supply side route. But not everybody was really thinking things were going to turn around, were they?
I think one of the important developments in that period was in the late 70s, President Carter appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Paul Volcker was very much aware of the inflation rate running very high in the United States. Consumer prices at one time were increasing over 10% a year. He was very much aware that this would threaten the stability of the country politically as well as economically. He moved to a period of very tight monetary policy, and I was fully aware of that. That tight monetary policy had its consequences. It slowed lending, it slowed speculation, it helped to break the back of the inflationary process. I also realized at that time, as Paul Volcker broke the back of monetary policy, he was gradually then beginning to ease. And I sensed that in my analysis. I made that call on August 17th, 1982, that the worst was over.
Do you think we will ever see a situation again if inflation starts to peak up? Will we ever see the Federal Reserve in America take that kind of action with rate increases? Can you imagine that again in the current political climate?
Change is one of the difficult things to perceive. Things can go along for a while. They never go to the extremes. I don't think in the United States such a situation would come about very soon. We're in a non-inflationary environment right now. In fact, as you know, the Federal Reserve is willing to tolerate inflation at an annual rate of about 2.5%. We're significantly away from that at the present time. I do think that no government here in the United States can tolerate for any extended period of time high rates of inflation. We're not in that kind of an environment. As you know, the pandemic is easing. We're coming back gradually economically. Europe is still suffering. Belatedly, we'll come back. I would expect that the capacity to produce goods and services as the pandemic diminishes, that capacity to produce goods and services will improve, and it will begin to hold down the inflation rate and will not go back what we experienced in the 1970s, where consumer prices at times were moving up at an annual rate above 10%. That is a far time away and is not in the cards, at least for the near term.
So you have a perspective that's going to be much different than mine, but you've got a much wider perspective. Speak to me about low rates, because we're facing a situation now, at least in the States and around the world, many places. I mean, extremely low rates for over a decade now. How does that shake out in your mind going forward? Because when I was a kid, the idea was, well, if you're learning about money and economics, you get a passbook savings account and you earn some interest. I mean, I don't think any young kid today, any teenager today, even bothers to know what interest is because they're not going to get any of that.
Well, in the immediate post-World War II period, interest rates were very low. In the 1950s, we had long-term government bonds, 30-year bonds, selling at 3%. And the Treasury bill rate was around 2.5%. Of course, during World War II, interest rates were fixed, not allowed to go higher because of the need to finance the war. There have been past periods, relatively low interest rates. It occurred in the 1950s and immediately after World War II. That can happen. The current low interest rates are partly due to the fact that the inflation rate is low at the present time. It's low all over the world practically, at least in the industrial world. This is a period of time, I think, when the pandemic is over, there'll be a resurgence of demand that will probably bring interest rates eventually higher. People tend to forget in the 1950s, a 3% rate on a long-term government bond was a reasonable rate. The Treasury bill rate at that time, when it was at 2.5%, that was deemed to be a reasonable rate. People did not get a high rate on the savings deposits at the time either. Then, of course, as we got into the 1960s, war came in and so on, interest rates started to move up. From a historical perspective, what we see today in terms of an interest rate structure by many of us is perceived to be, my goodness, very low, but there have been period of time. They were in the past at the current levels.
I have to say, in your new book, I really enjoy some of the cartoons that you found from the old news clippings. Those are great. Let me ask you I don't know if it's a personal question, but you're 93 years young. Can you give any pearl of wisdom about staying mentally sharp? I mean, here you are writing books and whatnot. That's no easy task. Most people never write a book in their lifetime, and you're cranking them out. What has been one of the secrets to your success, to your longevity?
I guess I'm fortunate to have the right genes in me, although my mother lived till 95, my father only till about 57. I think you have to keep active, at least mentally, and to some extent be a little active physically. If you keep at it, I think that's very important. I once listened to a pro golfer who was in the 80s. He was asked, what makes you the way you are? And the man says, if you watch me, the golfer said, I never stand still. Just keep moving around. I think that's what it is, to be active mentally and to try to be active a little bit physically as you get older.
Back in the day, in 1994, I did not get hired. My very first job interview on Wall Street, there was only one because I didn't go that path, but my very first job interview was at World Trade Center 7 at Salomon Brothers.
Oh, really?
You might have known him, but the gentleman that got me that interview was Jim Massey.
Oh, yes. I knew Jim very well.
Yeah. Crazy small world story, huh? I went to Florida State University. He was the only alumni connected to Florida State University on Wall Street. So that was how I found Jim.
Really?
It's crazy, right?
I've lost track of him. I have no idea where he is today.
Somewhere in Connecticut. Everyone's everywhere. Let me keep you at the end of your book because I really want to tear apart that last paragraph a little bit more, because you do lay out a scenario where you say, and I'm paraphrasing here, we're in this capitalist system. You can see we're moving towards statism. You make the statement, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, that this is maybe not what our founding fathers envisioned. That's an ominous comment.
Statism means where the government plays a substantial role in the activities of a country. That is through either fiscal policy or a tight cooperation between the central bank and the government in power. And it is a situation in which states themselves are not as independent as they used to be and become somewhat more dependent on the largesse of the federal government. That is what happened in this pandemic, really, so far. And there is no indication that this will be reversed very quickly. The credit rating of states and local governments has diminished as we have gone through this pandemic, and the local governments and state governments have become more dependent on the federal government. The idea of federalism that was created through our governmental process and our constitution and so on, that kind of federalism has diminished as a result partly of the pandemic, and the federal government is playing a much more important role in the behavior of economic and financial activity.
Let me push a little bit more there to try and get you to expound. How can the average person, taking that warning from you use the word, I believe, perhaps irreversible, how could the average person imagine if we keep going down this path towards statism to where it could affect their bottom line? I would think the average person right now says, hey, stocks are at all-time highs. My house is going up. It's easy to get a car loan. How can the average person imagine that this perhaps direction of statism will be negative for them?
The average person has been receiving checks from the federal government, which I think the average person cheers. The government is giving handouts to state and local governments to some extent, which the average person would be in favor of. But with that kind of change, it increases the power of the central authority, and it somewhat diminishes the power of state and local authorities. This giving is in place. I think the individual investor and the individual American is all in favor of it. But it is nevertheless an increasing the authority of the federal government and diminishes to some extent the strength of state and local governments. Whether that can be reversed remains to be seen. We have a political process by which it can be reversed over time, but this is the process right now.
What would you, though, envision? Just pretend it's me and you talking, but what could you imagine as a really negative consequence of this direction of more federalism and less state control? What could you imagine ultimately?
The ultimate consequence could be, and I don't think that will happen, is increasing authority comes from the federal government and it diminishes the power of state and local governments. And in that sense, you diminish the freedom of the decision-making, which has been partly rooted in local governments and in state and local governments. Authority becomes more concentrated rather than we've had up to now through a system of federalism.
I guess one way that maybe we could look at this is perhaps if we look around the world at some of the governments that have complete control over the population, perhaps we should, as Americans, we should be thinking, hey, all the way down to the local, county, town, city, state level, to have control at those levels is a good thing.
The federal government will have control over those areas if that comes about over time because of the power of the purse strings. The central government will be giving out the funds. Hopefully the state and local governments won't be dependent on that. We cannot afford in the United States a decline in the credit rating of state and local governments of substantial magnitudes.
Of all the things, when you look at politics, you look at economics, you look at the global situation, what concerns you? What spurs your thinking the most? What has your attention? Maybe I didn't even ask you about it today. What really grips you and keeps you active in terms of thinking and perhaps concern?
What concerns me to a large extent is financial behavior. Financial behavior in the United States now is problematical because equity prices are exceedingly high, price-earnings ratio are exceedingly high, interest rates are exceedingly low. There's a certain amount of speculation in the equity markets at the present time. There is a risk here that you could get somewhere along the line a testing of those excesses. You never know when they will appear and where they will appear, what institution may have serious problems or may not, what trading mechanism is at an extreme level of behavior. That's very difficult to pull out of numbers. But when you have such low interest rates, you have all kinds of trading activity that we haven't had before, there is the possibility of a failure in the circuit breaker, and the Fed would have to jump in very seriously. But that's very difficult to analyze.
Have you thought about these cryptocurrencies at all?
No, people have asked me this. Someone asked me a year ago when I had another book that came out, what about cryptocurrency? And I said, in response, I like flowers. Dates back,
Is that a tulip bulb reference?
That's right.
Yeah. Appreciate you coming on. I could just sit here and pick your mind. I want to tell the audience they should go check your book out, The Day the Markets Roared, How a 1982 Forecast Sparked a Global Bull Market. A great historical perspective. And I think, look, sometimes today, young people, they just think, well, what just matters is what's in front of me right now today. But I think having this wide perspective over many decades, many cycles, many different types of markets, I mean, when you look at it that way, you realize things change. We just don't stay the same.
God is correct. We change economically, financially, and we change to some extent. People getting younger and some people are getting older, and that's part of life.
I wish you best of luck. Do you have another book coming out next year? Can we talk next year also?
No, I haven't thought about that yet. Thank you so much.
Hey, Henry, thank you. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.